Hi, this is Robert Garmong, educator and philosopher, coming to you once again from my super professional studio here in Dalian, China. Now, today I'm going to respond to a couple of videos by Nathan Rich, in which he argues that the Western idea of freedom of speech actually supports racism. And I think it's extremely important to understand his argument for what it is, and that is a call for the end of freedom of speech. Now, in case you don't know, Nathan Rich is an American who came to China some years ago, not unlike myself. And he's also a lover of China, again, not unlike myself. However, he has somehow also fallen in love with the Chinese government, and that's where we part company. I give Mr. Rich a lot of credit because he's obviously done very well for himself, despite having overcome a pretty awful background, as he very frankly discusses in a couple of his videos. And I genuinely wish him the best. I just have profoundly different views from his intellectually. So Nathan Rich, if you happen to see this video, and I'm nowhere near the YouTube juggernaut that you are, so I have no expectation that you necessarily will, but if you do, I hope you can accept this video in the spirit of heated intellectual debate. So I'm a philosopher, so that's what we do. If you go to a philosophy conference, you present a paper giving your best arguments for your viewpoint, and you fully expect that you're going to get steep and even withering criticism in return. You do your best to defend your viewpoint, and maybe you even amend your view based on the well-reasoned criticism that you have faced. So I hope you understand that approach and take it in the appropriate spirit. So I'm going to discuss a video titled "The Truth of the Wuhan Doctor's Death." Now, for those of you who don't know, Dr. Wenliang is sometimes called the whistleblower of the Wuhan coronavirus. He was an ophthalmologist in a hospital in Wuhan who had seen a small number of patients with a form of pneumonia that closely resembled the SARS illness from 2003, and when he identified that it was also caused by a coronavirus, he posted a message to a small WeChat group of several of his med school friends. Someone from that group in turn forwarded his message, and it went viral, so to speak, and he was eventually detained by the police and forced to sign an apology for spreading false rumors. Now, later, of course, it turned out that Dr. Lee was essentially right. There was, in fact, a deadly new virus, very similar to SARS, although not exactly the same. He was slightly wrong on the details. And he died a couple weeks ago, and the Chinese public, mind you, not us foreign devils, but the Chinese public, erupted in sadness and anger when he succumbed to the disease. Now, Nathan Rich has said that the Chinese government was smart to quash Dr. Lee because his posting, which, let's note, was a private remark in a WeChat group consisting of 7 fellow physician classmates of his. That remark eventually got spread around and, says Nathan Rich, might have caused trouble. Quote, from a personal point of view, Nathan Rich admits, he did what he thought was right at the time. That's his admission. From an investigation point of view, however, that's a risky, dangerous thing to do. If you're in a team of people that's investigating a disease and you find out that someone is telling people in a WeChat group, here's the conclusion of this investigation already, even though the investigation is not done, definitely that can be dangerous to the investigation and to other things. Now, I think this is an absolutely key statement because it shows the statist mindset in full display. Now, when Dr. Lee sent out a note to a group of his friends on WeChat, there was no investigation ongoing. Furthermore, the evidence is pretty clear that the Wuhan government was hell-bent on there being no investigation. It's not that some guy was in the middle of a research project spilled the beans about the project, which could, in fact, corrupt the data and cause other problems. There was no research ongoing. Now, incidentally, Dr. Li, as I mentioned, was actually slightly wrong in his initial posting because he thought this was a return of SARS, and that turns out not to have been the case. So actually, Mr. Rich understates his own case. Dr. Li was actually mistaken at the outset, but that doesn't matter. The details here are very important. If someone is on a team, such as a business team, then there are legal and ethical obligations that come with that station. So, for example, if there had been a team of researchers studying the new virus in Wuhan, and Dr. Li had broken their confidence, then this would be entirely different. Even then, now the conditions may make it necessary to alert the public, while maybe you have a stodgy and outdated NDA, but at least there would be a prima facie case against revelation. In fact, in Western research teams, not necessarily in China, if you realize that your research could make an important difference to human lives on the ground, you will and you must break protocol and, for example, offer up a drug that had been simply investigatory up to that point. But that's not the situation here, at least as far as anything we know to date. Now, Nathan Rich is a Chinese government apologist, and I get that. It's fine to be a Chinese government apologist. Even the most guilty of criminals has the right to hire an attorney. At least in my country they do, not necessarily in China. But the case he's making is extremely thin. Quote, right or wrong, he says, it did make sense what they did, end quote. Now, wait a minute. Just take that at face value for a moment. He's saying, in essence, right or wrong, they were right. I don't buy it. Now, throughout all of history, there have been a plethora of various systems of government, but in essence, there have been only two fundamental philosophies of politics, statism and individualism. The statist philosophy holds that the government has the right, as a representative of an entity that it, at least in modern terms, typically calls the people, to suppress or control the individual. The statist philosophy holds that some entity called society possesses a superior wisdom and greater moral value than the individual. And this is exactly the philosophical approach that Nathan Rich is taking, and I just flat out disagree. I am an individualist, which means that I believe the individual is morally, metaphysically, epistemologically, and politically prior to the state. That is, there is no such entity as society, only a group of individuals, each of whom has his or her own mind to use well or poorly. People may cooperate or not, they may agree or disagree, but ultimately the individual is the only one who can form a thought or assess a value. Morally, I believe that every individual is an end in himself or herself, not a subordinate to society. And that in turn leads to the politics of individual rights, where each individual has the unalienable right to life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness, and the government has no right to infringe on those rights. Government exists to protect rights, not to violate them. And the really crazy thing is that in this particular case, Mr. Rich himself recognizes that I'm right. He himself points out that Dr. Li had the facts essentially right, as I would say closer to right than wrong, since as I've noted he got the details a little bit wrong. Mr. Rich, and I'm going to give him the benefit of the doubt here, seems to be genuinely pained about what happened to Dr. Li. But he comes down in the end on the side of statism, the right of the government to silence the individual who speaks out. Now, I actually feel somewhat sorry for Nathan Rich because this is one of those textbook cases for my side. And he's left attempting to defend a blatantly guilty client when there's just no reasonable defense to be made. Reality doesn't very often hand a philosopher real-life cases that are so perfectly crafted to prove a point. But here is one. The individual, Dr. Lee, saw a fact of reality that others had not yet recognized. He mentioned it to a small group of his physician friends who then publicized it. The government came in to detain them not because they were violating anyone's rights, but because they had spread an inconvenient truth. Now, if I were giving that as an example in a philosophy class, I would feel a certain pull to qualify it, to back off a little bit, to note that not every case is quite so blatantly obvious, because this is a little too pat, too obvious, too perfect, too handed down by God. And I would want my students to think critically about it and recognize that there are nuances and more difficult cases. But Nathan Rich is somehow forced to argue that this is not a smackdown case for individualism and against the Chinese government's statism. So that's why I say I feel a little sorry for him. Apologies. Now, I'm actually a little over my skis here because I'd planned to discuss two of Mr. Rich's videos, and now I've filled up an entire video just talking about this one. So I'm going to stop now with the promissory note that I will come back to a closely related issue in the very near future. I'll leave you with this teaser. This next one will be a topic that I've actually published about in the book, The Foundations of a Free Society, Reflections on Ayn Rand's Political Philosophy. And that's an issue that in some ways Nathan Smith and I might actually have some agreement on, albeit on philosophical fundamentals. I very much doubt he would disagree. He would agree with my ultimate conclusions. So once again, thank you for watching. Please hit like and subscribe. Please hit me up in the comments below, and I will see you next time.